Stories from Maine is a collection of true tales and legendary stories of daring, heroism, absurdity, disaster, and spectacle, all proving why many of the greatest legends in American history are our stories from Maine. In this all-new, weekly podcast episode of Stories from Maine, we celebrate Women's History Month with the true story of a legendary woman whose adventures and exploits in the Maine woods became known worldwide. She was an avid hunter and fisherman who pioneered outdoor sporting tourism in the Pine Tree State. She also became an author and a newspaper journalist, and the very first registered guide in Maine history. Stay with us for the story of Cornelia Fly Rod Crosby on this episode of Stories from Maine. Our podcast begins right now.
This is our all-new Stories from Maine weekly podcast for the first week of March 2025. Stories from Maine is authored by historian Lori Suzanne Dell. Her books, Stories from Maine and Stories from Maine 2, as well as all of her books, are available through book retailers and can be found on Amazon. The all-new book, Stories from Maine 3, Mayhem, Murder, and Execution in the Pine Tree State, will publish in May of 2025. You can follow Stories from Maine on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Spotify at Stories from Maine. And now, you can also find Stories from Maine on TikTok. Now, let's head over to James for another segment of This Week in Maine History.
In this segment of This Week in Maine History, we travel back to March 4th of 1861, when South Paris, Maine native, Hannibal Hamlin, is sworn in as America's 15th vice president, serving under President Abraham Lincoln. Hamlin becomes the first Republican to be elected to the vice presidency, and the first Maine man to ever be elected to this high of a position in a federal office. During the American Civil War, while serving as the sitting vice president, Hamlin also serves as a private in Company A of the Maine State Guard. During his time in the Guard, Hamlin served as the company cook, and was eventually promoted to corporal. I'll be back with another segment of This Week in Maine History a little later in the broadcast. Now, let's go over to Oscar for the story of Maine's own, Cornelia Fly Rod Crosby.
On November 11th of 1946, an obituary appeared in newspapers throughout Canada, Maine, and most of the United States. It was an amazing tribute to a Maine woman, one the whole world had come to know. It was also a fitting homage to one of the most famous Maine sportsmen in United States history, and it also served as an honorarium to the first ever registered Maine guide. Cornelia Thurza Crosby was born in the Franklin County town of Phillips, Maine, on November 10th of 1854. Her parents were Lemuel and Thurza Crosby. Cornelia was schooled locally and at home. Then she attended St. Catherine's, an Episcopal finishing school, in Augusta, Maine. She was a gangly young woman who stood 6 feet tall. She was lanky in appearance and was frail of health. As an adult, she worked as a housekeeper in hotels, as a bank teller, and as a telegrapher. As a way to improve her health, Cornelia began exploring the outdoors of Maine, and soon she began to fish. She soon became quite good at fishing, using primarily bamboo rods and fly casting equipment. Cornelia had become so well adept at fly fishing that many of the other sportsmen gave her the nickname of Fly Rod. Cornelia also developed a distinct love of the outdoors, such as camping, hiking, canoeing, hunting, and all forms of outdoor sports activities, which became her ultimate passion. And she endeavored to learn everything she could about being in nature, and especially the outdoors of Maine. Soon, She began earning a living by taking visiting hunters and fishermen into the Maine wilds. The oddity of a woman being their guide was enough to keep interested parties lined up for trip after trip. Flyrod was also a woman who was ahead of her time, as she was one of the first promoters of the catch and release philosophy. And she was the last person to legally hunt and shoot a caribou buck in the state of Maine. Cornelia became so well known and popular that she was eventually hired by the Maine Central Railroad to help spur Maine tourism and promote sportsmanship in the Pine Tree State. We'll be right back.
Our Stories from Maine podcast streams every Saturday on our Stories from Maine channels, on YouTube and on Spotify. If you are enjoying our podcast episodes, please help us by liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing our podcast on social media. And you can follow Stories from Maine on Facebook, Instagram, and on TikTok. You can also drop us a line at storiesfrommaine@gmail.com. Now, let's go back over to James for another segment of This Week in Maine History.
On March 2nd of 1797, the push for Maine statehood begins, as Massachusetts Governor Samuel Adams, one of America's founding fathers, directs that a referendum is to be held in the northern Massachusetts district of Maine. The referendum would help to decide if Maine should separate from Massachusetts to become its own state. But low voter turnout convinces the Massachusetts legislature, or General Court as it was known, that Maine wasn't ready for statehood. This political decision sees the District of Maine remain under the flag of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for another 23 years. Now, let's go back to Oscar for the rest of the story of Cornelia "Fly Rod" Crosby.
By the spring of 1897, a 43-year-old Cornelia Crosby had earned herself a name as a true sports legend in the state of Maine. On March 19th of that year, Cornelia received a telegram from one of the commissioners of Maine's inland fisheries and game. The telegram informed Cornelia that a new law requiring Maine guides to be registered and licensed with the state of Maine had passed the legislature. Out of a total of 1,316 Maine guide applications that were accepted, Cornelia was honored as the first officially registered Maine guide in the history of the Pine Tree State. Now, Cornelia was asked to use her popularity and knowledge of the Maine woods and sporting opportunities to help promote tourism in the state of Maine. Cornelia then began writing articles under the title of Flyrod's Notebook for publication in magazines and newspapers. These articles were written about her exploits and experiences in the northern Maine woods, and Flyrod's Notebook was soon syndicated in newspapers for publication all over the United States. Cornelia also began traveling to off-season exhibits, always promoting Maine as the nation's sporting playground. Soon, sports tourism in Maine abounded with paying, year-round sportsmen who sought an opportunity to live the experiences that they had read about in her stories. On one of her trips, promoting Maine, Flyrod hosted an exhibit event at New York's Madison Square Garden, while wearing a green, knee-length, doeskin dress, which caught the attention of all who saw her. In the eyes of visitors to the exhibit, Cornelia had just made hunting and fishing in the Maine woods a very sexy sport. By the early 20th century, Cornelia had become the undisputed queen of Maine hunting, fishing, camping, snowshoeing, canoeing, hiking, bird watching, foliage, and everything having to do with Maine's outdoors. Her name was known by sportsmen all over the United States, and many who traveled to Maine from other countries also knew the name Cornelia "Fly Rod" Crosby. Cornelia had also done a great deal to promote tourism in Maine, encourage conservation of Maine's natural resources, and to teach outdoor living to men and women visitors alike. On November 11th of 1946, one day after her 92nd birthday, Cornelia "Fly Rod" Crosby, perhaps the most popular and widely known woman of Maine, died at St. Mary's Hospital in Lewiston. Her body was carried home to Franklin County and laid to rest at the village cemetery in the town of Strong. In a time when women were only just beginning to find their voices in America, Cornelia Fly Rod Crosby heartily blazed a trail through the Maine wilderness, and she pioneered a new place for women in the all-male-dominated world of outdoor sporting. Today, Cornelia Fly Rod Crosby is celebrated as an iconic Maine trailblazer, sportswoman, conservationist, and one of the most legendary of our Stories from Maine.
If you have enjoyed our Stories from Maine podcast, then you should check out our Stories from Maine books. Both Stories from Maine and Stories from Maine 2, The Legends Continue, can be found through all book retailers and on Amazon. And you can join us on our Facebook page for daily posts, articles, and photographs, all celebrating the history of Maine. Now, let's go back to James for another great moment in the history of the Pine Tree State.
In this next segment of This Week in Maine History, we travel back in time to March 1st of 1642, when the shire town of Georgiana, named for Sir Ferdinando Gorges, a co-founder of the English colonial province of Maine, becomes America's first incorporated city. Known then as the province of Maine, Georgiana would eventually come to be known as York, Maine. We hope that you have enjoyed this podcast episode of Stories from Maine. Return next week for another all-new episode of our Stories from Maine podcast, and learn why many of the greatest legends in American history are our stories from Maine. See you then.
Please like and follow Stories from Maine on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and Spotify. And you can send us a message by emailing storiesfrommaine@gmail.com. You can also find new Stories from Maine articles in every weekend edition of the Brunswick, Maine newspaper, The Times-Record. Stories from Maine is a registered trademark of author and historian Laurie Suzanne Dell, and all original content for this podcast is copyright 2025, with all rights reserved. Thank you for listening.